Hey, so this morning I want to start off by having us use our imaginations a little bit. Hopefully the caffeine's kicked in. I want you to remember back to when you were a little kid growing up and what was your career that you were gonna do one day, right? Like what were you gonna grow up to be? That grand plan, that dream of, man, if I could be this, like my life is fulfilled. I want you to turn to your neighbor right now and say, hey, this is what I wanted to be when I grew up. Go. Hearing some laughs. Some of you guys are outing yourself right now. Where's my doctors at? Show of hands. Where's my doctors? Okay, got some doctors. What about lawyers? Any lawyers in the room? Man, you guys. Okay, some fun ones. Professional athlete? Yeah, there we go. Okay, what about astronaut? Anybody want to go to space? Yeah, let's go. I don't know about you, but I want to paint a picture for you of 7-year-old Bryson. He is adorable and perfect in every way. And I had the illustrious dream of growing up to be none other than a zookeeper. And before you laugh, it was gonna be sweet, right? Like playing with baby tigers and riding on giraffes. It was gonna be amazing. Until when I went to the zoo, I started paying more attention to the zookeepers than the animals themselves. And I started to notice that pretty high on the pecking order of what zookeepers have to do, I guess the word is they have to clean up the animals' business. And that's a little bit of a dream crusher, right? And so that career melted away. But what's still there in my heart, deep, deep down, is this like core love for God's creation, right? Expressed through love of animals. Like you're looking at a guy that if you're a hunter, you look at your wall, you see a 12-point rack up there. I see Bambi that you brutally murdered. That's just who I am. But, however, there's one thing in my life that is a stronger motivating factor than my love for animals, and it's FOMO, baby, fear of missing out. Any FOMO people here in the room? You hate missing out on stuff. And so back in high school, I had a couple of buddies that said, hey, Bryson, we're going frog gigging tonight. You wanna come? Is that a thing down here in the South? Do we frog gig down here? Yes, okay. I had no idea what it was, but I'm not about to miss out on a good time, right? And so I'm going with my friends. We sneak out on a golf course in the middle of the night because I guess there's a lot of frogs in the water traps. And I just think we're just gonna like catch the frogs and pet them. I don't know what we're gonna do, right? I'm sure you can imagine if you know what frog gigging is, you can imagine the horror on my face as this nightmarish night ensued for all of these poor frogs. And then all of a sudden the conversations shift to like this barbaric, like, hey, we're gonna cook them and eat them. Anybody eaten frogs in here and liked it? That's disgusting. You guys need to like repent of sin. That is, ugh. I think the most profound thing that came out of the night though, I think I was trying to get rid of all the trauma in my mind and just trying to change the subject. One of my friends though shifted to a conversation on cooking frogs. And he told this story about how to cook a frog in boiling water. And he said, hey, the way this goes, Bryson, if you just dropped a frog right into boiling water right off the bat, it would jump out immediately to preserve its life. However, and some of you maybe know this, if you put a frog in cold water and you slowly but surely heat the water up increment by increment, degree by degree, the frog will be lulled into this false sense of complacency and normalcy all the way up until it's too late and it's boiling alive. And as I'm reflecting on that story, I just wonder if some of us this morning are a frog in a pot. And we haven't even recognized the fact that our life has just drifted to this spot where we are now surrounded by this environment that is so devastating towards our thoughts. You know, we are, if you're just now jumping in with us, we've been working through this series called Every Thought Captive, where we are learning about our thoughts, right? The power of our thinking, how important our mental landscape is towards our health and our habits and the way we see ourselves, the way we see God. I love how Paul, the Apostle Paul, put this in 2 Corinthians to kind of set the landscape for us. He says, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments with every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And what we've learned is this, like whether you realize it or not, there is at any given moment a war that is happening in your mind, trying to dictate your thoughts that then shapes the way you live. Like our thoughts are so powerful in terms of forming and shaping and driving our habits and who we are and who we're becoming, to the point that they can either derail our lives or we can surrender them over to God, align them with his truth, and be transformed through our thoughts. What does that look like? It looks like this idea of taking every thought captive. That we don't just change the way we think about or just stop thinking certain things. Like what ultimately happens is anything that comes into our mind, we take it, we wrestle it to the ground, and we begin to ask some really interesting and difficult and profound questions that maybe we've never asked before. Like, hey, where did this thought come from? Or why am I thinking this way? Or if I were to continue to entertain this thought, like how would this play out in my life? How would this present itself? Or maybe like this train of thought, this way that I'm thinking, like has that been passed down to me from other people before? Like we come to this place of learning how to examine every thought that comes into our mind and run it through the lens of God's truth, because we have to take our thoughts captive. Because if not, as we've learned about, our thoughts can develop these neural pathways that run deep, that build this deep sense of identity that can oftentimes become these strongholds in our lives that we talked about last week. These lies that we begin living out of that form and shape us in so many different ways. And so tragically, in the midst of all of that reality and landscape, just like a frog that has been sitting in water that has slowly been reaching a boiling point, I think, because I'm seeing it in my own life, so many of us are coming to a place of maybe recognizing for the very first time that we are surrounded by an environment in a current cultural context that is just so devastating towards winning the war in our mind. For instance, sociologists will tell us that we now live in what's called an attention economy. It's kind of this cultural reality that's designed to capture and monetize our focus. For instance, if you were to travel back in time and talk to someone 20 years ago and tell them that we would one day be walking around with a device in our pockets that would just alert us nonstop, in fact, 2,600 times on average a day, with interruptions and news articles and headlines and distractions, that person would say, that sounds like torture. And yet here we are, like headline after email, after notification, after ping that keeps us clicking and scrolling and consuming content. We're exposed to between 4,000 and 10,000 advertisements every single day. And we all know that every single one of those advertisements are designed to try to make us think a certain way. Especially like, hey, without this, your life is empty. This is really fascinating. I read recently that we now produce more content in 2 days than all of human history created from the beginning of time all the way to 2003. And that is bombarding your mind nonstop. Another recent research article pointed to the fact that our attention spans as average Americans is down to 8%. That's down 4% from 25 years ago, and we are officially lower on the attention span list than goldfish. Yeah, swimming around and running into glass all day, and yet more thoughtful than you and I, right? Like this is the landscape we find ourselves in. Think about our phones. I had somebody tell me this once. It was so profound. He said, Bryson, if you really think about it, like our phones have forced us into a position to operate in many ways past our human limitations, to try to more so operate like God does, which obviously we can't. Like for instance, our phones seem to give us this expectation of needing to be omniscient, right? That at our fingertips, there's everything happening all around the world, and if you don't know what's happening, you're missing out, you're living under a rock, right? What's wrong with you? Or what about omnipresent? Right, that 24/7, these things are going off with emails and texts and phone calls of people demanding your immediate response and attention. We can't keep up with any of this. It's like a frog that all of a sudden realizes, oh, I'm in boiling water. Like we find ourselves swimming around in this boiling pot of distraction and input and consuming content that is just wearing our minds down. It is a incredibly hurried and fast pace that our souls can't keep up with. In fact, I had a conversation that broke my heart this past week. I was talking with a friend. We were unpacking just the series that we've been working through and how good it's been. And my friend said, Bryson, especially last week's on strongholds, what a powerful idea I've never thought of before. But Bryson, here's the deal. I'm really struggling to even feel like I can sit down and identify and name and process the different emotions that I'm feeling or identify strongholds in my life because of just all of this mental clutter in my head that won't shut off. He can't even imagine the ability to sit down and somehow be introspective of what's deep down in the core of his heart and soul. I love these profound quotes on this. T.S. Eliot, a poet, said this once: "We are distracted from distraction by distraction." How about that? Theologian Ronald Rolheiser put it this way. He says, we're distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. One of the best theologians of all time, the Apostle Paul, wrote something similar to this to the Ephesians in his letter to them. In Ephesians 4, verse 17, he says, hey, you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. It's really interesting, that word futility, it literally could be translated as emptiness. Right, that the Gentiles that Paul's talking about, just the people of the culture around there, they're so filled up with this idea of so much input and content and things vying for attention that their minds are full, but ultimately their minds are full of nothing. Emptiness. Things that are purposeless, that lead nowhere meaningful. It's the thoughts and the input that just floods our mind and demands our attention and yet produce no lasting value. He says it another way. We've studied this passage, Romans 12:2. He says, hey, do not conform to the pattern of this world. We talked about through this series that it's so easy to immediately just jump to behavior modification or our habits, but beneath those are the lies or the thought patterns that manifest in those habits. What Paul is speaking to is not this idea of morality and behavior. It's this empty thinking that forms mental habits that shape our inner lives. One of those pathways or patterns I would call is the empty pattern of distraction. The empty pattern of distraction. That the emptiness of us being trained to expect constant stimulation, to fill every quiet moment with noise, to avoid stillness at all costs. The stats are staggering, not to depress us anymore, but we spend 2.5 hours daily on average on social media. Some of us are like, oh man, I don't want you to know what I spend on social media. That's the average. Nearly 4 hours on average every day on television. Imagine all of that time taken away from family and relationships. We touch our phones 2,617 times a day on average. It's created what psychologists call a continuous partial attention. It's the idea that at any time we can be in one place but not be here. You guys know what I mean? Like you're sitting here maybe right now and you're already thinking about watching college football later tonight. There's a great game on between Notre Dame and Miami that I am super pumped about. But this idea that we are constantly in one space and yet not in one space at the same time. And when we're switching back and forth between tasks and stimuli, that has real consequences on our brain. Like the part of our brain that is responsible for focus and decision making, it actually begins to weaken and to break down. And our brain's alarm system, like the fight or flight system, is just ratcheted it up to the point that we are finding so many of us in just this state of kind of chronic low-level anxiety. Like maybe you know how this feels, right? You get home from work and you just crash down on the couch and you can't relax because your mind is just like going a mile a minute. Maybe your hands are even shaking a little bit, like a physiological response. We've lost the ability to be fully present anywhere because our brains have been trained to expect constant stimulation from everywhere. Like silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness feels like we're wasting time, especially in the culture we live in. A second pattern of emptiness would be the pattern of pleasure. It's the emptiness of the relentless pursuit of immediate pleasure and gratification. We've been conditioned to believe that I need something now, and if I get it now, then I'll be happy. And this just spills out on just a constant quest for more. Things like same-day delivery, $389 billion with a B, $billion annually spent on advertising. Just unreal. All of those messages, you deserve to be happy right now. Our products will get you there. We know this, right? We binge Netflix instead of dealing with difficult emotions. We make impulse purchases to help give us a little bit of a mood boost. We watch porn for a sense of companionship. We eat for comfort as opposed for nourishment. We seek validation through things like how many likes or comments we get on posts. And the problem is the constant chase for immediate gratification and pleasure, it wires our brain just like distraction. That all of a sudden we find ourselves in a place that when we get that dopamine hit, that reward neurotransmitter firing, it just makes us want more and more and more. Scientifically, we become less satisfied with real life. Like we're less able to find joy in the simple moments. I think about Holly and I went to the beach about a month ago, and we're just sitting there with the girls enjoying the sand and the sunset, and there's a bunch of people over here like with cameras and phones like taking pictures of the sunset. Not that that's wrong, right? It's gonna be a great screensaver one day, but I'm thinking like, why don't you just put your phone down and look at the sun, right? It's amazing. The idea that we can't be content just being in the moment. The research shows that the more we pursue immediate pleasure, the more we build up a tolerance level of needing even more pleasure to reach those same levels of happiness. This is why, for instance, pornography is so damaging on a marriage relationship. Because all of a sudden, maybe a spouse that is wrestling with pornography starts demanding more and more and more of their spouse in terms of intimacy that the spouse doesn't feel like they can live up to. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. We need more and more stimulation to achieve the same level of happiness. A third pattern would be the empty pattern of offense. It's the emptiness of our culture's addiction of taking offense and staying angry. Sociologists will say that we're in what they call an age of rage. It's really easy for people to get triggered and angry a lot quicker than what it used to be. And we know this for those of us that have social media. Like our algorithms understand that what sells, what gets the most clicks and posts and comments is like the most inflammatory titles, right? Headlines, things that are gonna get us to question and be fearful and have anxiety and confirm biases that we might have of other people. It's the picture of scrolling through social media, just looking for things to be upset about. Or it's all of a sudden you find yourself in an argument with someone in a comment section online and you're just like, what am I doing? Like, what is even happening right now? Constantly consuming news that makes us feel anxious and angry, feeling this strange satisfaction and pointing out someone else's hypocrisy, or this idea of being quick to judge others while being defensive about our own mistakes. And in the same way, just like with distraction and with pleasure, what's happening neurologically is that transmitters are firing in response to these empty patterns that we follow and walk. Like specifically with offense, there are feel-good neurotransmitters that are released in your brain when you become offended. That's what helps you feel self-righteous in that moment. Like, man, I'm gonna give it to them, right? Like they deserve to hear from me. And not only that, but this idea of when we begin to share our outrage or what we're offended with other people, and then they reinforce that, like, yeah, you should be upset, and me too, I'm angry about that too. That creates this social bonding phenomenon that sociologists call moral outrage. So it just is reinforcing. But beneath this is this idea that once again, when we are constantly taking offense, when we are easily angered, easily triggered, our fight or flight system in our brain is constantly on. And it's keeping us in this state of high anxiety, high stress. We become more wired for reaction versus careful and thoughtful thinking, where it becomes easier and quicker to judge and slower to listen and even slower to love. We lose capacity for things like grace and nuance and deep thinking that leads to understanding all of this chaos with pleasure and offense and distraction. Just the devastating effects on us as humanity are unparalleled. Like, for instance, we've lost, so many of us, like I said, the ability to be present. Like, I wonder, and I'm saying this to myself because I'm equally guilty in this, I wonder when's the last time we were able to sit down and have a conversation with someone where our mind isn't somewhere else. And this happens to me all the time, right? I'll be sitting with Holly and we'll be unpacking the day and she'll be sharing something she's really proud of or something that was really hard with the girls, but yet my mind is on an email I've got to send or a text that I got to catch up on. And then she does the whole, "Are you listening to me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, totally." "Well, then what did I say?" And then I'm busted, right? But this, we understand this on a deep level. The other day, I'm catching up on texts, and my daughter comes up to me, Madison, right? And she says, "Hey, Daddy, can you play with me?" And instead of dropping everything right there to go and play with my daughter, I'm like, "Hang on, baby girl, I need to keep responding to these." And what was communicated to my daughter in that moment, who knows? The conversation I need to have with her at some point of, "Baby girl, like, you are more important than what is on Daddy's mind." Another thing is we've lost the ability to think deeply. I blame AI for this a little bit too, but just the idea that complex problems require sustained attention and careful reasoning, but we've trained ourselves for these quick responses rather than thoughtful responses. We've lost the capacity for deep relationships. We see this online, right? We are the most connected culture of all time, and yet the most lonely culture of all time. You can have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Facebook friends and yet not feel like anyone truly knows you. And all of the things vying for our attention, they compete directly with things like time and attention and vulnerability that's needed to build deep relationships. Most damaging is we've lost the gift of contemplation. Like, we've lost the ability to just sit in silence and not have social media going in our hand or having a podcast or TV playing in the background. Like, some of us are terrified by the idea of silence. We don't want to be alone with our thoughts. And so we have trained ourselves in this culture to just do, where all of a sudden I'm sitting with my friend, he's like, "Bryson, like, this stuff is blowing my mind, and yet I don't feel like I have the ability or capacity or even know how to sit and identify different emotions I'm feeling and recognize the lies that I have been living, the strongholds in my life because of everything jumbled around in my head." Like, our brains are so filled with emptiness that we can't even get down to the root of what we're actually dealing with. I think the heartbreaking tragedy and irony behind all of that is the lies, the strongholds in our lives, they're actually, like, it's a defense mechanism. It's masked by these different patterns. The distraction, the pleasure seeking, the offense, oftentimes beneath them is the stronghold, is the lie, is the deep insecurity that you have been living out of, right? Like, behind just the mind-numbing scrolling on social media, comparing yourself to other people, is the deep sense of insecurity that you will never measure up, and that's the stronghold. Behind the constant chase for all of this different pleasure seeking, underneath that is the hole in your heart that you have had since you were a child, maybe something traumatic that you went through, that now it's like self-medication, trying to find ways in which to fill that hole. And in the pleasure seeking, you lose sight of the hole itself. For some of us, it's the idea of the offense, of like trying to just lash out and get angry and carry this kind of self-righteous, like, I'm right, you're wrong, let me prove it. And then underneath all of that is this deep, deep, deep insecurity that you are just inadequate, that you'll never measure up, that maybe someone in your life one day said, "You're wrong, you'll never be right." And now you're just living out of this sense of offense. Like, beneath these empty patterns are the strongholds themselves, and yet they are so clouded by these patterns. We just see habits in our lives. We just see, well, this is the way things have always been. And we miss out on the very thing that God wants us to dig into, that you're not good enough, that everyone else has it figured out, that I'm falling behind, that if people really knew who I was, they wouldn't love me, that I'm not as smart or successful or as spiritual as I pretend to be. Like all of these things that we believe, that are these lies and these strongholds. But because the world is just so bombarding us with input and distraction, we can't even carve out time to sit with and identify these things in our lives. I can tell you about Mike. Mike became entrenched in this stronghold of, I'm not worthy of people's love. Nobody likes me, or I'll never belong. And then you can combine that with the over-sexualized culture that we live in today, and all of a sudden, Mike battled a decades-long addiction with pornography because at least through the screen, he felt desired and wanted and a companion. I can tell you about Caitlin. Caitlin battled this deep insecurity of feeling like she had to always measure up, that she was always constantly trying to prove herself. And what that turned into was just this empty pattern of just chasing all of this different performance and success and trying to prove her worth in school and in her career. And all of a sudden on the weekends, she's just bombarded by Slack messages and emails, and she's not shutting any of it off because she wants to prove her worth, right? And then all of a sudden she looks up one day and she has just an incredible lack of depth in relationship, and there's no genuine rest for her soul. I can tell you about my friend Tamba. Tamba is a friend of mine whose story is marked by just this empty pattern of pleasure that was ultimately masking this deep insecurity and message that he had carried since he was a child. Check out this video.
People always told me you're gonna be something, you're gonna be somebody, and that's the kind of mentality that I had growing up. Fast life that I wanted to live, the promiscuity, and wanted to go partying and drinking. I have core memories with alcohol that were good.
I was raised in Liberia, and a part of just West African culture is this idea of if you're not a doctor or if you're not a lawyer, then essentially maybe you're not as successful. I always felt like I needed to be at least one of those things to make my parents proud. So when I got into college, I started off as pre-med. I was like, well, this is not really what I want to do. And I switched to art. It was my first year in college. I had never drank in my life. So that's how I got my first taste of alcohol. It made me a lot more confident. I felt like I could go up and talk to any girl. It wasn't maybe 2 years, in 2008 is when I picked up my first non-DUI. I graduated college, and then I'm driving in Louisville one day, and I see this billboard up there, and it said AMTC, Actors, Models, and Talents for Christ. I auditioned for all these different agents, and I got an offer as an actor in LA. Say I had a commercial. When those moments happened, I would try to super promote them because then it would give me this feeling of okay, I'm finally being something, I'm doing something, I am validating my existence. And in those moments, friends would come around, we would celebrate, and when they would leave, I would just celebrate with more alcohol. But nothing lasts forever. So people will go back to their lives. The commercial is no longer on TV. That thought comes back. You're back to where you were. You're still nobody. Alcohol became a true companion for me. And it was in LA that I crossed the invisible line where you can no longer control your drink. If I take a drink, I won't stop. The acting thing wasn't going well. I went into selling cars, and then now I lost my job, so then I have no money. I'm in this apartment. I don't know what's gonna happen. And I remember that was the first time in my life, I believe, I contemplated taking my life. And I had been drinking so much, my esophagus is like burnt. Each time I drank, it would hurt, but I couldn't stop. I went to go see a friend of mine in Atlanta, and as I'm leaving Atlanta, I went to a liquor store. It opens at 10 o'clock, and I walk right in there and get me a pint. I left at 10 o'clock. It was like 7 or 8 p.m. I'm in the middle of Tennessee somewhere, just drunk. And next thing I know, a police officer taps on the glass, and then that's when I get arrested in Tennessee. And they say I have to do 40 days in jail. And the very same night they let me out, on my way back from Tennessee, I stopped by a liquor store. That drink turned into a 3-week binge as I'm staying with my brother, because at this point I had lost my apartment and everything while being in jail. During those 3 weeks, I just felt so lost again. And I don't know what came over me, but I remember just quietly walking out of the room, sat on the couch with him, and just broke down. And I said, man, I need help. He calls my mother. She reached out to the church. My mom is a member at the Southwest campus. ARC, Addiction Recovery Care, had just started working with Southeast. I picked up the phone. I talked to this guy named Matt. He's like, man, if you need help, we can help you. I was just mentally tired of trying to do this on my own. And that was the first time in my life where I think I surrendered my thoughts and my feelings and my will over to God and say, just do what you want to do. You never get to this place to where you say, I'm healed. I'm living and walking in freedom, but there is a daily discipline that I must maintain. And if you're not coming back to remind yourself of the truth over and over daily, eventually it'll get replaced by something else. So you just have to do that daily so that your mind is always set on, this is what God's truth is for me. I am not my performance. I am not what I do. I am who I am because God says this is who I am. And I have to do that every day.
So good, so good. What cuts through the noise? What can cut through all of the distraction and the chaos in order to center us in a place of joining God and what's happening in our hearts? I think one of the most powerful stories in the Old Testament is found in a passage in 1 Kings chapter 19. If you know this story, the prophet Elijah has just had this amazing showdown with some prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel. Like, he's riding this spiritual high, and then all of a sudden, here comes all of this input. Like this input on threats against his life, and all of a sudden the input of just insecurities that he's wrestling with, that he's all alone and no one understands him, and it leads him to fleeing into the wilderness to come to Mount Sinai. And he's just riddled with anxiety and depression, so much to the point that he just says, hey, God, will you take my life? And all of a sudden, God shows up in this really profound way. 1 Kings 19, verse 11, a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. Hey, Elijah, what are you doing here, man? It's like when all of the noise, all of the chaos subsided, what Elijah is left with is the sound of God's voice speaking to him. And don't read this question as an accusatory type question. Read this as an invitation. Hey, Elijah, what are you doing here, man? why don't you come here and join me in what I want to do in your heart and in your life? It's a picture of a dad who's like found their kids scared and alone, inviting them into conversation of examining what's happening. Like, can you hear God asking you the question, hey, what are you doing here? You've got all of the chaos of the scrolling and Instagram and Facebook and comments and Twitter. Well, I guess it's X now. X and TikTok and everything. And all of a sudden, if you take a moment to pause, you hear God asking, hey, what are you doing here? What's beneath all of this? What are you seeking? You've got the pleasure seeking that has marked this life of just chasing the next high, chasing the next dopamine, chasing the next thing that's gonna make you feel validated and fulfilled. And then all of a sudden, taking a step back from that, you hear God's voice saying, hey, what are you doing here? What are you trying to fill in your heart? You're walking around angry, just frustrated all the time, like wearing anger as a badge of honor, stepping out and into a place of self-righteousness, and all of a sudden you hear God say, hey, what are you doing here? What are you trying to prove? Elijah, until he stepped out of the cave and past the fire and the earthquake and the windstorm, past all of the chaos, and just stepped into God's presence. Until he did that, he was blinded by his fear and the empty patterns of this world. And all of a sudden, when he steps forward into the invitation, like he hears God's voice, and it changes everything for him. God sees past the busy adult and sees the lonely child. That God sees past the angry Facebook post or comment and sees the deeply insecure person. That God sees past the scrolling and the shopping and the performing and the trying to fill everything in our hearts, and he sees the hurting soul. The problem is, we live in a world that is at war with us and doesn't want to give us that space to hear God's voice. And so what does that look like for us to just be able to disengage from the chaos, to step out of the cave of fear and noise and input into the silence of God's presence? Some things that are helpful. One would be like a technology-free space in your life. Like, we're actually gonna do this church-wide this week, but you're gonna hear more about it, but we're gonna step into as a church a 3-day social media fast this week, where you pick 3 days this week to say, I'm staying off Facebook, I'm staying off Instagram, I'm staying off X, whatever that looks like. And I'm gonna say no to the doom scrolling, and I'm gonna say yes to having more space in my life to hear God's voice. Holly and I, early on, we're not perfect at it still, but we both had Fridays off together, and so we would do what's called like a digital Sabbath, where on Fridays we would literally turn our phones off and put them in a corner for a good portion of the day so that we could sit together and enjoy our time and our presence together and not be distracted by everything vying for attention. Another practical way to step into silence would be wisdom of input consumption. It's this idea of recognizing the difference between being busy and being fruitful, between consuming information and growing in wisdom, between digital connection and real intimacy. Asking yourself, hey, this input that's coming into my head, is this connecting me more with God and others, or is it distracting me and distancing me from connection? Lastly would be this idea of embracing silence. The early church fathers and mothers and spiritual leaders all throughout the centuries would call this a spiritual discipline of silence and solitude. You see this in the life of Jesus, right? Where he would often withdraw to lonely places to just disengage from the crowds and be present before the Father. And so what does this look like? To carve out these times in our lives where we don't have anything playing in the background or anything distracting us that we are scrolling through, and we're just simply sitting with our thoughts and with God and examining the emotions that we are walking through, and I know that for some of us that's terrifying, and yet that's where some of the greatest transformation can take place, because when we begin to create space for God's voice, like something beautiful happens. Like we start to remember who we truly are. That we are not like the insecure, anxiety-riddled, approval-seeking person that the world has formed and shaped us into. We are a deeply loved child of God. You just start hearing his voice. You start hearing, hey, I love you. With you, I'm well pleased. And nothing can separate you from my love. You cast all your anxieties on me because I care for you. These aren't just nice cliches. These are the truth markers that demolish the strongholds in our lives that we talked about. And even though the world is not going to shut up and there's going to be constant input and distraction and things coming your way, God is speaking. We just have to be willing to step into the silence, to say no to the distraction and the chaos, just to listen for his voice. I had this moment the other night. If you're a parent or grandparent, you know, like little kids, grandkids, man, God gives them as a gift, I think, to help us understand him in just profound, beautiful ways. At this moment, getting home from work where, you know, I kissed Tolly and Lucy and didn't know where Madison was, and I went to her bedroom and she was playing with toys, and she was so excited to see me when I got home. She said, "Daddy," and came over and gave me a big hug, and then went back to playing her toys. And I just kind of sat there, and you know how with your kids or your grandkids, you just love watching them do anything, right? Like whether they're drawing or painting or playing music or playing with toys. And so I'm just sitting there with like the biggest smile on my face watching her. And eventually, like she was so distracted with her toys, but she turned over her shoulder. She's like, "Oh, you're still here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm still here." And she came over and gave me another hug again and then went back to her toys. And guys, I think that's the moment that God so deeply desires for you to experience. That we get so distracted, but God hasn't gone anywhere. He's right there with you. And every single moment can be a moment to turn and to recognize his presence, to still our hearts and allow him, through the power of the Holy Spirit, to do the work in our lives that we could never do on our own.